So kicking things off, before we start talking about Trump, we've got Sean Spicer. No, I'm just kidding. I'd like to begin by asking Jim here, having gone through 6 editions of this book now, what are some of the central takeaways or perhaps the central point that readers should take away from it?
Good. Well, first of all, I want to welcome everybody here, the students, alumni, they want your jobs, so be careful. They're looking to be involved in applied politics here, many of them. This book is a merger of the wisdom of people who've been there, like Pat, and have been involved along with some well-known academics. It's a book that has a very simple central thesis, and that is the way you're elected fundamentally influences the way you behave. And even though you have unified party government, you can have a very conflictual situation. It's hard to cooperate sometimes, as we've seen with President Trump. The deadline for this book was February 1st, so several of our chapters sort of project out what might happen. I had several scenarios, I won't go through them, but one of them was when push comes to shove on certain issues, they may indeed, he may indeed express some bipartisanship, as he did on one thing so far. But let me tell you, one point does not make a trend. There's a whole lot of talk about DACA and other things, but that was a fairly easy way to come together with the Democrats. This book covers polarization and its impact, Sarah Binder, the impact of elections, the trend towards unilateralism that's going on by the president. There's an excellent chapter on regulation in the Hill and the President by Claudia Thurber, my wife, and also a great chapter on congressional investigations. Pat and Gary Andrus they've written again a great piece on White House congressional relations, and Ross Baker, who worked in Reid's office, looked at cooperation and when it happens, why it doesn't happen. Then we have a chapter on judicial appointments in the judiciary, President and Congress. I've written one on domestic policy, Jordan on foreign policy. So it is, we've learned a lot since the first edition, a great deal. This is a shorter book, it's all new, it's crisp. You can get through it without falling asleep. And my students seem to like it so far. We'll see at the final exam. But let me just say that we analyze the impact of structure. We're a very bifurcated system and polarized. We have the President, Congress, House, Senate, Republicans, Democrats, Republicans versus the far right, authorizers versus appropriators. And then this impact of polarization and gridlock is very important. It's gotten worse, in my opinion. We can get back to this later after this election, but I'll leave it at that.
All right, thanks a lot. So Jordan, as the new guy on this book, justify yourself.
Well, let me tell you, this guy's a joy to work with. He's very careful, excellent writer. And he doesn't irritate you when he finds stuff that I've written that he suggests changes. I liked it. He's a great guy.
Well, it was fun working on this with Jim too, and I'm grateful to him for bringing me on board as a co-editor. And thanks, David, for sponsoring this event. And it's great to have you at AU, and wonderful to have you leading the center here. I think the main contribution of the book in general is that it's looking at the relationship between Congress and the presidency rather than looking at one of those institutions in isolation, because there's a ton of literature about Congress, and there's a ton of writing about the presidency, and in academia, political scientists tend to be Congress scholars or presidency scholars. Not all of them are one of those things, but a lot of people identify as one of those things or the other, but there's not as much that's focused on the relationship between the two institutions, and that's what we're trying to highlight in the book. And we also wanted this book to speak to multiple audiences, that it's a book that's presenting scholarly research, but it's accessible to students and to people who are not academics. And we wanted to speak directly to the Trump era. So Jim mentioned that the deadline for the book was the very beginning part of the Trump presidency. This presented a bit of a challenge in terms of how to write about a relationship that was just getting started, but we did write about what we saw up to that point in the relationship between Trump and Congress, and tried to consider how the relationship might play out going forward. I think what stands out in terms of the substance to me is just the continued relevance of the notion of rivalry between the two branches of government. So there's a great deal of writing and discussion in the media about partisan polarization in American politics. Polarization between the two parties tends to be the main fault line that people think of as being a place where there's discord in American politics, and I think there's not as much focus on the tensions that exist between the two branches, regardless of party, and the notion that even when there's unified government, as there is now, when there's Republicans controlling Congress and a Republican president, there is still a lot of tension between the two branches, and this is in part because presidents and members of Congress have different incentives, they have different outlooks. Presidents, for instance, have an incentive to think more broadly about national welfare and national interests. Members of Congress, because they have smaller constituencies and aren't held accountable for sort of the overall state of the country, have incentives to act in ways that are more focused on satisfying more parochial concerns and interests of their constituents, and that's one source of tension between the branches, regardless of which parties are controlling the presidency and Congress. And in the Trump presidency so far, we've certainly seen a lot of difficulty in the relationship between the president and Congress. Trump struggling to work effectively with the Republican leadership of Congress, struggling to get his agenda through Congress. And this, I think, is partly because of Trump's own personality and leadership shortcomings, which are familiar, I think, to most of us. But this relationship is never a cakewalk, even for a perfect president. In the past, unified government has never been easy for presidents. So I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot. And Pat, having been both a participant and an observer of the executive branch and the legislative branch and their relationship for such a long time, can you provide us a little bit of that historical overview and situate this presidency and this Congress within that history?
I'll give it a try, and thank you for having me here. I appreciate it. My sense is that Trump has. I'm not carrying a brief for his policy agenda or what he, but I've been feeling that he has been unfairly, at least harshly, if not unfairly treated in terms of the observation of his administration in the first 8 months. Again, not what he's trying to produce, but how he's been doing it. And I think that's basically because people don't look at history, or they have a rosier kind of view of it as you get away from history. It's kind of like a rear view mirror. You're driving away and it just looks better and better as you get away. Or they find him unseemly. They find him boorish and offensive to the Washington elites, which I would include everybody in this room and everybody downtown. He just doesn't act. He just doesn't act properly according to the explicit and implicit standards. But if you do a quick comparison in terms of putting together governments, his stumbling around in terms of integrating the campaign with governing the White House look no different in some ways, except he does everything more. He's somewhat exhibitionistic, or you know what I mean. The Obama campaign had similar struggles in working through the Plouffe advice, the Axelrod advice, and the trying to build a campaign with Rahm and Pete Rouse. You look at the Clinton administration, same kind of thing. Carvell and Greenberg were constant inputs in how we were to, given President, how we were to behave, and struggling with, on a daily basis, of how do we govern. And actually, it took us longer than the Trump administration to sort out who was what and when that was going to happen. And when it finally turned the corner. If you look at people being hired and fired, if you go back to the Clinton administration, you know, we were throwing them out the window and moving around deck chairs. You had George Stephanopoulos being taken off of the press secretary, Dee Dee Myers put in, then she was fired. You had Howard Pastor, who had my job, he was fired. You had Mac McCarty, and this is all in the first, almost the exact period of time. And you had Mac McCarty promoted somewhere, and Leon became the chief of staff. Leon Panetta became the chief of staff, where things finally turned a corner. So in terms of managing that challenge, we were pretty messy, and the Obama folks had people leaving in that first year, and they probably had five and a half chiefs of staff four chiefs of staff until they settled on Dennis, and took longer actually to kind of get that resolved. You look at successes, except for Obama, who made, saved the country by his financial bailout, which was not part of his campaign. We had minor successes in the Clinton first year. We forced Democrats to vote on tax increases and spending cuts. We then asked them to vote for NAFTA. A little later, we asked them to vote for assault weapon. We failed on health care, and bingo, we lost the Congress. I don't think we ever quite got it right. I look at what Trump has done, maybe no shiny objects in terms of legislation, but he has turned, he's going to leave an imprint, whether it's we like it or not, on environmental and energy policy, probably for the next 10 years. He's done it on labor regs, he's certainly has mixed it up on immigration. So I think we got to keep an eye on the ball in terms of who's had impact, lasting impact. You look at poor George Bush in his first 8 months, Democrats were licking their chops. They thought he was toast and that we were going to just bury him in that first year. I think he might have gotten No Child Left Behind, which, I wouldn't hang my hat on that. But by 9/11, boom, the whole thing turned around. And lastly, on the congressional relations. In the Clinton administration, we had supermajorities, but boy, how to screw up a supermajority. We asked the Democrats to operate among Democrats in passing tax increases, as I mentioned, having the House do one kind of tax increase, and then changing our mind in the Senate, which sounds very familiar if you think about the health care piece. And I tell you, we have rapidly damaged our relationship with Democrats going forward. It just got worse. I mean, then the assault weapon ban, and then the failing of health care, not wanting to work with the Republicans. We didn't find our groove until we got divided government, and we worked with. We had a successful year in embarrassing the Republicans on their budget proposals, but Clinton made a conscious choice not to work with the Democrats going into the '96 election. He didn't ask them. He didn't tell them. He didn't consult with them. He just jammed them. And we worked with Newt and Trent Lott and had a lot of successful legislative successes, welfare reform, CHIPS, small business taxes, and the framework for the budget. And in that presidential year, Clinton won by a landslide, and the Republicans expanded the majorities and the Democrats didn't. So I think Trump is trying to do the same thing. It was clear he gave it a shot on working with his majorities. It was clear that he was distancing himself as he was hammering Ryan and McConnell, among others. And then it was not a surprise to me that he made his move. Everybody acts like he's just this impulsive freak. Well, that may be part right, but I think there's a little more method to the madness. And I think part of that is intentional, part of it is incompetence. But the general trajectory is not as off as people want to think. My fear as a Democrat, now I put that hat on, my fear is he starts getting this right, and if he can withstand the 2018 election, and I'm not even sure he's worried about impeachment. It didn't hurt Clinton. He's had the highest numbers of his whole presidency after impeachment. And if he can withstand Mueller, he could be a formidable character in 2020.
Thanks a lot. You touched on a lot of things that I want to come back and talk more about. But first, I want to ask Professor Carroll about your perspective with respect to the party system and how you think the Trump presidency, the candidacy, the nomination, the election, and now the presidency of Trump might be affecting the Republican coalition, the elements that make that up, the future of nominations, the future success of the party, and so on.
Well, thanks. It's great to be back here. I want to answer your question, but if I can, I want to just respond to what Patrick said a little bit. It's great to see somebody who had worked for the other party being as generous as possible with in this bipartisan way. But I mean, I think overshot a little bit. By this time in the calendar, George W. Bush had gotten his big domestic initiative, not just No Child Left Behind, but the tax cuts through, and with Democratic as well as Republican votes. And the Clinton administration, in the first year, the parental leave, almost in the first days, the Parental Leave Act, not just assault weapons in '94, but '93, the Brady Bill, which was a separate bill. You've mentioned NAFTA, you mentioned the Clinton Economic Program. And it's true that the Clinton administration failed on health care. That hadn't happened this early in the calendar. It went into 1994. So I think the Trump administration, at least on the legislative side so far, does look unsuccessful compared to other recent administrations, even in this polarized era. One other way to see Trump administration performance with Congress is distinctive. Just the failure to name appointees and get them confirmed. The Washington Post, for people who are interested in this, they have this big spreadsheet they keep updating. They just updated it again, and they show that how many people Trump has nominated, how many he's gotten confirmed, comparing him to all the presidents going back to the first President Bush, and he stands out. For having relatively few people in office, and that's still true. So, but having said that, and we know, all of the ways that Trump is unique. I teach the presidency, and the students are so young; they have no historical memory. The only other president they really know is Obama. I mean, they were sort of vaguely aware that George W. Bush was president, but they were too young to really have an opinion or know what he was up to. So of course, Obama and Trump is a huge contrast, so it's my job to explain, no, he's different from everybody, all the other presidents, in various ways. But on this issue of the party system, as it affects governing, I want to talk about that maybe a little bit. There are trends that Trump, you could see him in some ways as the culmination of, and they affect governing. So we talk a lot of times about counterfactuals, trying to understand a situation. We have a theory about how things are working. We want to explain what factors are important. What if you change just one little thing? So let's just very quickly do the thought experiment. The final four presidential contenders. So we know who we have. We have President Trump. We came very close to having President Clinton. And then the other two, Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders. If we think about their relationship to Congress, Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz also ran against Congress. It's hard to see that if they were elected, things would be going smoothly. There would be some differences, of course. Hillary Clinton, of course, a different story. The candidate party establishment, many long-standing relationships with people in Congress. But, when DACA came out, as Jim already mentioned, one of the things to think about is there's no way that Hillary Clinton would have been able to, I think, make progress on something like this with the Congress. Not because she didn't want to. She's more committed to certainly to immigration reform than Trump. But it was just entirely predictable that had she won, and she would have been blocked from day one by Congress, by Republican majorities in both houses of Congress. This is what they did to President Obama, and from their standpoint, in many ways, it worked. They were rewarded for this. So there are unique aspects to Trump and to his style, but the bad relationship, the tensions between the parties and within the parties, I think, predate him. In some ways, he is a symptom as much as he's a cause of these tensions. So I don't think things would be going smoothly. As I say, with Clinton, it would be different. I think the administration would be going more smoothly, less drama, but not necessarily a lot of legislative progress had she been president. So we can talk more about, party coalitions and things like that, but I thought maybe that's more directly responding to the other panelists.
Great, thanks a lot. So Jim, I want to turn back to you, and I want to talk a little bit more about this domestic policy agenda and what we've seen over the course of the past 9 months, and maybe especially over the course of the past couple of weeks, whereby, as was mentioned down the aisle here, Trump seemed to go for a while trying to hew the party line and work with members of Congress, with leadership anyway, seemed to get really frustrated, and in the past couple of weeks sabotaged them, right? Cut a deal with quote-unquote Chuck and Nancy, much to the chagrin of Republican leadership, and then now seems to be moving in the same direction, or trying to, with DACA, with House leadership and Senate leadership not even being in the room. So I'm wondering if you want to comment on some of those things and maybe speculate about the legislative agenda moving forward.
Sure, the question is bipartisanship blooming, and will it stay around for a while? Different kinds of policies drive different kinds of coalitions and cooperation or conflict in politics, and we all know that. Yes, there was bipartisanship on the $15 billion Hurricane and Flood Victim Fund, and extending the CR to December 8th, and extending the borrowing authority sometime into the spring. We know that, but that, when we have a clear external threat to the United States, or a problem that people agree to, things happen pretty fast sometimes. What are the other issues? What are the other possibilities? Infrastructure. It, to me, seemed to be a logical one at the very beginning, where you'd find some bipartisanship, but it looks like it's going to be impossible to move ahead. On infrastructure, it's not only party, it's all kinds of federalist battles, but also different interests, the airports versus the bridge people versus the natural gas people, all of that. So look at infrastructure. Maybe we'll find some bipartisanship. DACA, I don't see the party coming together on the Hill. Let me just put it in this context. When Ryan took over as Speaker after Boehner failed to deliver pizzas to the White House because he was so weak, as we all knew, he passed 28 bills, very important bills, where he had the support of and needed the support of the Democratic Party. And then he was roundly criticized. I mean, there was an education bill that Alexander pushed through in a bipartisan way in the Senate. There was CERCLA, there was TPA, passed by one vote, on and on. It is possible, but the problem is the Republican Party. The House GOP leadership has very little capacity, in my opinion, to rein in its rogue members. It's still going on, and on these issues, it will continue. Healthcare. Not a lot of discussion about it, but the extension of the Children's Healthcare Insurance Program is up on September 26th, and it covers 9 million children that live below the poverty level. Maybe we can get some bipartisanship on that. I don't know, but it's not a big discussion. Secondly, extension of the ACA subsidies to reduce deductibles and copays for lower income enrollees. There's some hope there because Alexander's put together people behind the scenes, which you've got to do, in my opinion, groups behind the scenes, and he's pushing forward in Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee in the Senate side it looks like a bipartisan bill. We'll see, but it's not replacing or repealing the Affordable Care Act. It's trying to repair it a little bit so it can survive. Tax reform. Wow, that's very hard. There's no logical coalitions there that last between the parties, a great deal of difference within the parties, and significant number of Trump supporters in the polls look to they support raising taxes for people over $250,000. I mean, it's a populist movement, and they're very concerned about that. And they don't want cuts in entitlement spending. So how can you, as we all know, handle reducing the debt and the deficit? Let me go back just very briefly and respond to Pat a little bit, add to Pat, and just say that there's an excellent book on Obama. It's called Obama in Office, by me, that looks at his phenomenal success, Pat. I mean, they passed 338 bills, became law. He had a 97% presidential support score. Clinton, the first 2 years, had an 86% presidential support score. I know they're controversial, but it's a way to measure it. Nobody really wrote about that very much. There was a clear problem. The economy was in the Great Recession, so he pushed things very quickly and got them passed. It took 18 months for the Affordable Care Act and then reconciliation. The Republicans weren't with him. But even though he was an amateur, in my opinion.
Your words, not mine.
Yeah, an amateur and the professor president, as he liked to explain things in great detail, in the end, he did pretty well. 338 laws in that first 2 years.
Let me just respond to both of you guys. First of all, I didn't say anything about Obama because I think he did have a pretty after he saved the
And
country, I think it kind
I
of.
said I was adding to your comments.
But my point was not looking at what's on the scoreboard. My point is what legislation passed that has lasting impact and it is of some political consequence. And if you look at the Clinton administration in that first year, we had consequence. We lost the damn Congress. And we still haven't recovered entirely from it. The forcing Democrats to do tax increases and spending cuts, or having Bush pass tax cuts, that's like bringing coals to Newcastle. I mean, that's not what I'm talking about. I think what we've not paid enough attention to is the impact Trump will have on us. What Obama uses as a strategy for 4 years in using executive branch and executive orders to govern, Trump has unraveled them, and the consequences will be lasting. They just are. I'm not trying to win 10-6. I'm just saying they will. And I failed to mention the other thing is that he's got Gorsuch in. If he and McConnell are successful, which I'm absolutely certain they will have dozens and dozens of judges probably confirmed before the end of the year, which will change the judiciary for generations. So we might find it, we can look at bright, shiny things and keep score that way, or you can look at what impact this guy has had on this country in a very short period of time. And I think I think that's a more of a historical question rather than simply adding the sum of this bill or that. I remember I did it for Clinton. We had a bunch of bills, and I used to line them up and make presentations and wanted you to count them over on education, on the environment.
Bill Clinton had a card.
He had a card. I made the laminated card that had all of our champions. Yeah.
Laminated.
But we were just kidding ourselves. They weren't. It didn't amount to anything as we got clobbered in '94. It doesn't. I don't want to say it. It's not the same. They were not consequential in the moment, and they haven't had a lasting impact, but for a few.
But then a quick response. He is making lots of progress on deregulation, re-regulation, but he's not going through Congress to do it.
Well, but Obama governed for 4 years like that.
Yeah, I know, and there's a whole chapter on unilateralism in there about how maybe it's overreaching. The point is that with respect to Congress, he hasn't really made much progress in pushing his agenda. He has on the regulatory side.
Well, I think that's right, but I was talking about presidential impact
Yeah.
and consequence. Believe me, my analysis has nothing to do because I'm trying to be bipartisan. I'm anxious. I am extremely anxious, and my caution is we got to keep an eye on the ball,
Yeah.
and
Sure.
rather than make him a
Jordan, I
buffoon.
don't want to leave you out, but David is itchy.
Oh, no, Jordan, can go ahead if he.
No,
All
go
right.
ahead.
Well, I
You're
mean, I would
responding.
think, okay, I want to just, to respond to the response. The two things here I think we have to separate. On judges, I agree with you. I mean, I don't know that Trump, I think Trump is not doing anything different from any other Republican president, and really it's McConnell. I mean, McConnell, the reason that there was a vacancy for Gorsuch to fill was because McConnell violated norms, and you know, this is part of the polarization that Jim has written so much about.
Do you think the
taught
credit
us
gets
about.
sorted out that way?
Well, I'm not talking about that. I don't think this. I think the point is, what's the distinctive impact of Trump? I think any, you know, getting your party to, when they've already they get rid of the filibuster, so you only need to get your party to support the Judicial Supreme Court nominee. It's very important, and I agree with you that this is going to have, I mean, he looks to be a very young, healthy justice, so we're talking about a very long-term impact. And now on the appellate and lower level courts, they're weakening the blue slip, or maybe getting rid of the blue slip norm procedure, which would make it even easier, as you say, to bring in more judges. So I think that's really consequential and important. Again, I say that's more McConnell than Trump. On the deregulation and executive orders, you know, for the most part, one president's order can be reversed by another one. Historically, that hasn't usually happened. That's because most executive orders aren't very controversial. We've seen Trump has reversed some. Sometimes, especially in the foreign policy area, an order or any kind of unilateral action creates all sorts of consequences that tie the hand of a later president. But I don't think in the areas of sort of environmental or energy regulation and things like that, I don't think or labor regulations, I don't think that's true. So I don't know we don't know how long the Trump administration is going to run. So we don't know how long these orders are going to be in place. But if there's a Democratic president with a different point of view, a lot of this stuff will be gone. That's not true of Gorsuch, and that's not true of the lower level court nominees. So on that part, I agree with you.
But one comment on the regulations. Industry takes the regulations seriously. They invest accordingly. And so much so that some of the industry players are asking him not to reverse Obama because they have spent billions and billions of dollars to accommodate them. You spend another 4 years making these changes, you're going to have a similar problem. And then I hope, well, maybe you're not hoping, but I'm hoping that he
Yeah.
doesn't have another
No.
4 years. But you guys are keep talking about winning. I'm talking about impact. And there's an overlap, but it's not exactly the same.
All right, thanks a lot. So far, we've been talking about domestic policy a lot, and I'd like for Jordan to chime in here and talk about foreign policy and how the Trump administration is affecting foreign policy, but also maybe more to the point, how the Trump administration is affecting presidential and congressional relations as it relates to foreign policy.
Sure, yeah, so I'd say there are two striking things that have happened in the first 9 months on foreign policy. The Trump administration has pursued a nationalist foreign policy. Trump's used the term America First. That was part of his inaugural address. So pulling back from the world in certain ways, but also emphasizing military power a lot. Congress has, and this is completely new, this has not happened before, since World War II. Congress has become the protector of an internationalist American foreign policy. So presidents have historically been internationalist broadly and favored, deep, extensive U.S. engagement with the world, sort of across different areas, and have, for instance, always favored robust spending on diplomacy, foreign assistance, and it's usually been Congress who's cut back when there's been, cuts to foreign aid, where the State Department budget, for instance, has usually been Congress has been more stingy than the president. This year we've had Congress do the opposite, where Trump proposed a cut of about 1/3 in the State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development budget, and most of that's spending on foreign assistance. The appropriations process isn't completed, but the House has passed legislation that would be only a 17% cut. That's still a big cut, but it's half of what Trump had asked for. And the Senate has passed its version of the bill that would be only a 10% cut. And so ultimately, Congress is going to pass appropriations that'll at least preserve a lot of the funding that Trump wanted to cut, and that's really important. The other area where Congress has been active, and it's notable, the most important first piece of legislation that Congress enacted was the sanctions bill this summer. That was the first major piece of legislation that Congress enacted, and notably in a bipartisan manner, but it was a different kind of bipartisanship because there was bipartisanship between Republicans and Democrats on the Hill, but Trump didn't want that legislation because it imposed sanctions on Russia and also restricted his authority to lift sanctions on Russia. This was the kind of new dimension of it compared to previous sanctions legislation. Under this legislation, Congress would have a period to review and be able to overturn any lifting of sanctions on Russia that Trump might try to pursue. And previous sanctions legislation haven't had that kind of provision. It's striking. This isn't totally new because Congress has often passed sanctions bills that presidents haven't wanted. There's often been tension between the branches around sanctions issues going back decades. But for Congress to do this on a very high-profile issue where the president's kind of political standing is on the line in a sense because the Russia investigation is so volatile and everything concerning Russia is very volatile, it's striking that congressional Republicans were willing to kind of stand up to Trump on that. What's still kind of left hanging is the Russia investigation, and we still don't know how the congressional piece of the Russia investigation will play out. Several congressional committees are still pursuing those investigations. Will Republicans in Congress, in the end, be willing to sign reports that, state that there was inappropriate behavior by Trump or Trump advisors or associates in matters concerning Russia? That would be, even more notable if that happened, but we don't know how that's going to play out yet.
Thanks a lot. So I want to make sure that we do preserve some time for audience questions, and there are a lot of you here, and you probably have questions to ask. I thought first, though, if you guys are willing, I was going to do a rapid-fire series of things here where you can offer up a single sentence or less in response to your speculation on these things. And the first is whether or not the wall gets built. Jim, do we get a wall?
No.
Okay. Jordan?
No.
Okay.
I think we get bits and pieces.
Okay. Yeah, I think Laura Ingram the other day said, what if he had said, we'll build samples of the wall, and the American taxpayers are going to pay for it? David?
Yeah, I don't see it either.
Okay. What about the DREAM Act, or for anybody who isn't familiar, the deferred action on deporting the Dreamers or the immigrants who are brought here as kids, which seems to be moving forward, but we're not clear. Does the DREAM Act get passed, Jim?
I hope it does, but it goes against his base from the election, and his base is very different than the traditional Republican coalition. They're not on the same page. If it was only the people on the Hill and the Democrats, you could get through, but it really goes against the core base. And Breitbart and everyone else is already
On him. This
on
is
him
why
on it.
it's so interesting.
That's
Jordan?
not one word,
Right.
sorry.
Right. No, that's fine.
I'd say I'm uncertain about this one, but it's going to be threading the needle of getting Democratic support without sort of losing all the Republicans is really hard, because in the past we've seen Republicans defect often when legislation like this comes on board. And if this is viewed as a Schumer and Pelosi bill, that's going to, you're keeping Republicans on board too is going to be really hard.
Only first names now.
Yeah.
Miss Chuck and Nancy. Yeah. Pat?
I think the Dreamers get protected one way or the other.
All right. David?
Well, we have to disaggregate just quickly. I mean, there's protecting them, and then there's the path to citizenship and so on. I think the former is more likely than the
Okay.
more ambitious version of the DREAM Act.
All right, thanks a lot. I've got two more of these things, or maybe three. What about 2018? Do the Democrats take back control of the House?
No.
No?
No.
Wow. Jim? I mean, Pat?
I'm not giving up yet.
Just go ahead, David.
I think it can. I definitely think it can happen. I think there are Republicans retiring. Trump's numbers are very low. We've seen big midterm swings with less provocation. So I think they can do it in the House.
Yeah. For the record, my vote is yes.
I'm feeling better, David.
All right, well,
But remember, there were only 31 seats that were competitive last time. Maybe
I
we're up
know.
to 50.
I
and
know.
2/3 of those are Republicans, I hope.
It's gonna be
Yeah.
tricky. So this next one is actually contingent upon the last one, but if we can go ahead and say for a second that the Democrats take the House in 2018, does Trump get impeached?
No.
No.
I think we have Trump for 4 years, no matter what, so take a deep breath, stop praying and hoping.
Regardless of Mueller, regardless of what happens with Mueller?
Yeah.
Okay.
You mean impeached versus convicted? Or-
Well, I was gonna start with impeached and then move to remove.
Yeah, maybe the
but-
House
yeah,
impeaches him, but he doesn't get convicted.
Doesn't get removed.
I'm going to
Thank
punt in the sense, I think it really depends on what comes out of the investigation. So I think based on everything we know now, I don't think
Yeah.
that there's the smoking gun that would really be, would enable impeachment to go through. And the Democrats would get a backlash, I think, if they pursued it in this circumstance. But if sort of more comes out that's more incriminating, then I think it could happen.
Maybe the smoking money from the loans in 2008 will affect people's attitudes.
I don't know. Pat?
I don't think it matters. I think he'll learn how to make the most of it. Like I said earlier, it worked for Clinton. And I think he can play. What he should be worried about is the oversight that would come with the Democratic control of the Congress will just be unrelenting. Not him, but his cabinet folks, these people he has put his confidence in, will be ripped apart. That,
David?
Yeah, I definitely don't, I think Jordan gave the right answer. We just don't know what's gonna be unearthed, and so we're really, in a sense, opining on that. But I think the Democratic leadership saw, they were around, Chuck and Nancy were around when Clinton was impeached, and they know that that did not work well for Republicans. So I agree with you, there are gonna be a lot of investigations, and they're gonna unearth a lot, but I don't think you're gonna see an impeachment when there's no chance of a conviction,
Right.
which is what happened 20 years ago.
Right. With respect to that, I wonder if any of you have any thoughts, if Trump does continue on this so-called third way that we've seen him engage in for exactly 1 week, maybe 10 days, if he were to continue with that, if he were to continue striking deals with Chuck and Nancy, if he were to continue to leave out Mitch and Paul and try to go his own way and presumably anger the right wing, at any point do you think that they decide that they would be less inclined to defend him in the same way the Democrats in the Senate defended Clinton in 1998?
Well, I think that he may try to build coalitions around different kinds of policies, as
Yeah.
I mentioned before. And Pat knows a lot about triangulation, and it's not everything. It's where you can find some common ground that may occur. And in some of those areas, it may not irritate the leadership that much. I don't see the leadership, I mean, they've got unified party government. They're going to try to make it work. What they're irritated with, I think, is his bizarre random behavior with tweets and other things, saying, I'm for single payer, and then, oh, wow, gee, healthcare is complex. I didn't really mean that. These things keep coming out. I think they're inside the leadership, they're very irritated with that. And this last piece, publicly, going with the Democrats, irritated them, but they also have to live with him, and they'll continue to try to work with him.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I think right now Trump is still just popular enough that for most Republicans, the kind of cost-benefit analysis of abandoning him isn't, the benefits of abandoning him aren't quite outweighing the costs that they can pay from getting a primary challenge or having, Trump supporters, really become hostile to them. If Trump becomes more unpopular, his approval rating drops down into the low 30s or, even lower than that, at a certain point, then more Republicans will start abandoning him, I think.
if I could just make two comments. One is that the Democrats, we very reluctantly supported Clinton through the impeachment, the Senate, especially the House. There were, behind the scenes, there were numerous inquiries and requests for him to resign. So this was not a love fest. It was really challenging. But on this, whether or not Trump keeps up this thing with Chuck and Nancy, to me, that's tactical. I think his strategy, as cumbersome as it may be, is to keep people guessing. And everybody wants to think that he just is totally impulsive, and he certainly has that tendency. But I think that, whether right or wrong, I think that's what his game is to just keep. I think that's the way he does his negotiation. I think that's part of the New York Goomba kind of thing. and you make people worried. And I think that's the strategy, not the triangulation.
You can say the New York. We
I
can't.
know from-
We can't.
Any final comments, David, before I open this up to everybody?
Let's hear from the audience.
Let me add one more thing.
Oh, sure.
The retirements are an indication that there are a bunch of Republicans that are worried. Riker was in a competitive district and went over the mountains, and if you know the state of Washington, if you go over the mountains in the Cascades, you get very, very conservative people, and he had very liberal people. What happens in those districts? Do you get a Republican out of that or a Democrat? And that'll make a difference in how many retirements have we had? 5 so far. We'll watch that.
All right, how about you?
Hi, I'm Richard Skinner. During the 2016 campaign, Trump was actually kind of all over the map on a lot of issues. There were a lot of times when he was vague, he was centrist, he critiqued himself, and he's also, the rare times when he did seem to have a clear agenda that was something other than the normal Republican agenda, it was his nationalist agenda about trade and immigration and maybe a non-interventionist foreign policy, although it wasn't all that clear. We haven't seen all that much of that side of Trump as president so far. Not much the side of the centrist, not much of that distinctive nationalism. Instead, we had like 9 months of a basically very conservative Republican president and like a week where he seems to be compromising on immigration in pursuit of an end that, you know, probably President Jeb Bush would think was fine. You know, dreamers and drones, sure. That's kind of like the moderate Republican answer. Why did we see this? Even though this is a guy who doesn't have much of a background in Republican politics, isn't any kind of an ideologue, he ended up pursuing a pretty conservative Republican agenda, both with Congress and in the executive branch.
Yes. Next question.
Oh, I think Richard put his finger on a really important phenomenon that as distinctive as Trump is, both his background and how he was nominated and elected, and as much sort of atmospherics and drama as we had, policy-wise, not that distinctive, and on most issues, and so some of that represented doing 180s on campaign promises, and we see that in a couple of ways. One way, things like, you know, he said explicitly, this is almost a verbatim quote, he says, "I'm not like the other Republicans, I'm going to protect Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security." Maybe it's not the conservative thing to say, but that's what I think. And then he endorsed, you know, healthcare bills that so far didn't succeed, but would certainly violate that promise. And things like, from what we hear about the tax policy that's being planned, all this populism is pretty much gone. And then on Jordan's point, Trump's distinctive foreign policy, which is against kind of what I'm studying and working on, kind of bipartisan elite opinion in the whole post-war era, he's backed off of some of that. Some of these are smaller things, like he was going to move the American embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which candidates promise to do, presidents never do. Well, he didn't do it either. He hasn't started a trade war with China yet either. I think the renegotiation of NAFTA is probably going to be pretty limited. So in some ways, he's backed off of these things. And
Peace Codes, too.
What's that?
The Paris Peace Accord.
The Paris, well, that.
I mean,
that's
not
still,
Peace Codes.
yeah, the Paris Environmental Accord, we're still not sure about. There have been conflicting reports lately. Okay, so the two things are, you know, his party has a majority in both houses of Congress. And we could talk about triangulation and things like this, but to triangulate against your party when it's in the majority is kind of different. And so I think that, I also think they're unique things. He doesn't obviously have a lot of policy knowledge. He did not, his movement, to the extent there was such a thing, didn't have an infrastructure, didn't have policy intellectuals, didn't have anyone else. So I don't think he really saw much of an alternative to working within the Republican Party on these. And that's what he did. And it hasn't been so successful so far, as we've already discussed in terms of legislation. But it's kind of interesting because this is kind of the extreme case. And even a president like this worked so far mostly within the party structure when it came to policy.
So let me add, I didn't mean to be so flip. I think adding to this, I don't think he has a clear strategy, theme, and message of governing, and I don't think he had it in the campaign except for some of these broad statements about America First. And yeah, he drilled down on immigration and a few other things, but it's not clear what he wants, and that, I think that bothers, it makes it very difficult for the leadership on the Hill to work with him, because they want to have a strategy going ahead and rank ordering what they want to deal with, and he's all over the place.
Are you going to add something, Jordan?
Yeah, I think that part of it, I think, is also simply, who is around him. That, during the campaign, people like Steve Bannon were a large portion of the people who he was talking to on a regular basis, and naturally, in becoming president, he's talking to a set of people more who are, more representative of the establishment, and
So I was just gonna say, specifically, Bannon's gone, Gorka's gone, Priebus is gone, right? As the real
Was Priebus
establishment
ever really
Republican.
there?
Presumably he was doing something, right? But in terms of a connection to the Republican establishment on the Hill, he was it. He was Ryan's guy.
Yeah.
And so it might not be a coincidence that very recently with Kelly stepping in, we've seen this shift.
Right. And then I think part of it also that there were moments when he, followed the Bannon line, and there were some costs, like the travel ban. That was something that was, that was a Bannon type of policy, and it didn't work. There was this, the courts, blocked it, and so then there was probably some learning of, well, maybe it's better to, vet policies more carefully, and be more careful about policy development.
Plus, he's running into the rule of law, the Constitution, professionals in the bureaucracy,
Imagine.
professionals in the military, and they're
Deep
very
state.
close to him, and it's limiting what he's doing, in my opinion.
Yep.
Thank you all very much for these very interesting comments. I wonder, given what's been said thus far about tensions between House and Senate, about tensions between executive and legislative branch, and the strange positions that Trump has been taking on a number of issues, what does this mean for the future of the two parties? You've alluded, of course, to the rifts within the Republican Party. I don't think Democrats are wholly unified, although at the moment things look as though the triangulation might prove helpful to the Democrats. What does this mean going forward as we approach 2018 and beyond that for the two parties?
Thank you. I was hoping somebody would ask that question. David, do you want to start with
Yeah,
that?
why don't you start?
Yeah, well, I think it's easier for the Democrats now, they don't have the White House, they don't have the majority in either house of Congress. They have some power, which is not always appreciated, because not only do you need 60 votes for a lot of things in the Senate, but the House Republican leadership cannot count on the votes of the Freedom Caucus sometimes for even really must-pass legislation, so that gives Pelosi and the Democrats some leverage. But as far as the public is concerned, the Democrats are not responsible, are not in power, and Trump is remarkably unpopular for a president at this stage, and especially with Democratic voters. So I think that people say, oh, the Democrats, they're in such terrible shape, and they have so few seats, and this and that. When there's a president of your party in office, the party in power loses seats in the midterm elections. So the Democrats are a very low point in terms of governorship, state legislative seats in Congress. And I think that they have nowhere to go but up. The only two midterm elections that didn't go this way in, the lifetime of anyone in this room was the Clinton impeachment election, which is the one reason why I don't think the Democrats want to do this on Trump unless they really have the goods. And after 9/11, which is a unifying event, the president is a commander-in-chief and so on. So I think it's going to be, the Democrats, people say, oh, people don't know what they stand for, blah, blah, blah. The opposition party, it's a myth that the Republicans won because of contract with America. Nobody knew that. That was something that Gingrich told journalists was important. So I think the Democrats are poised to make gains, not necessarily because they're doing anything brilliant. I think they've held together very well, and they've made it so the Republicans couldn't get the health care bill through. So I think they're doing well in the short term. And they're going to make gains in 2018. We're not sure whether they're going to get the House back, but it's imaginable, and it's more imaginable than it was, let's say, in January. And then the Republicans is more interesting in some ways, because there's this whole discussion about how different Trump is. And stylistically, he's different. He's really different. But if you look at the exit polls from the Republican primaries, Trump did as well with self-identified Republicans as independents. Now, that was not true of Bernie Sanders, for example, who did well with independents. That wasn't also even Obama against Hillary Clinton in 2008, or McCain against Bush, party establishment candidate in 2000. They all did better with independents, not Trump. And so Trump, I think, has given voice to a lot of sentiments that Republican voters have had for many years that their party leaders in Washington haven't fully reflected. This is the Republican primary electorate that is a result of Barry Goldwater, the Southern Strategy, Reagan, Willie Horton, 50 years of kind of dog whistling and using white identity politics. And it turns out that you can't just turn that off so easily when you want to. And so Trump reflects a lot of what Republican voters, not necessarily Republican donors or Republican staffers, but a lot of what Republican voters believe. And that's one reason why a lot of them are sticking with him despite, failure in the legislative arena, months and months of bad coverage and so on.
But in terms of the future of the party, we need to look at party organization. We really have 100 parties. Democrat and Republican Party in each state is very different. Obama didn't care about that organization and really didn't work at it. I don't think Trump is at this point either. I mean, he's not going out and trying to build the party apparatus where he needs to build it. We're talking at the national level. I'm talking, locally. The one thing I think the Republicans would like to do, the establishment Republicans, is come up with a better way to control recruitment, rather than having 17 and then the carnival barker jumps out of the 17 and gets free media. I think they'd like to have a better way of controlling that, and I don't know how they can do that.
Democrats are struggling with that now, but they're not putting the resources that are necessary to do what Jim's saying, I think, at the local level. But I totally agree with what you said. Right now, Democrats have to, at the national level, I believe, have to remain disciplined and not really emphasizing the alternative. They really got to let these guys hang for as long as they can before they will be forced at some point. I don't think it'll be much. It will be before the 18 election, and then I think you'll start seeing it shift a little bit. But that discipline where you're not putting the alternative out, because these guys is we struggled with in the Clinton administration, how long we waited before we put anything that looked like an alternative to what Newt and those guys were doing. Clinton was like dying, chomping at the bit to put something, and it took everything to hold back, and I think it was the smart move. It's not maybe the best move in terms of the country, but I think from a tactical move from this congressional leadership, I think it's what they'll probably continue.
So this fear, or a lot of what's been written about Democrats don't have a message, should be discounted at least until the
Yeah.
2018
Yes.
election.
Totally agree.
Well, some of them do, the single-payer party.
Well, there's
people
that.
do. Yeah.
Is that the Democratic
Child
Party, or
care.
is that Bernie Sanders?
What was the
Childcare, too.
Republican message in 2014 when they won back the Senate?
Right. Obama's bad.
Gone.
Overreach,
Okay, good enough.
overreach.
Yeah.
Obama's bad.
Were you going to say something?
Yeah, just on the Republican side, I think one of the interesting things will be what becomes the party position on those issues where Trump really went against Republican orthodoxy, and then how does the Republican Party play out in that sense? For the next presidential election, when someone else is on the ballot on an issue like trade, where Trump adopted this very anti-trade position, which really deviates from what's been the Republican orthodoxy for so many years. Will the Republican Party, default back to, the kind of business-oriented, pro-free trade stance it's had for so long, or, is this going to be a lasting change in terms of, how the party talks about that kind of issue? David, you've
Yeah.
written about that issue. Yeah.
I'm very interested in it. I would say that's a big question for me too. I don't have the answer, but I'll just say Trump so far has done so much less than one might have thought on that. He did unsign the TPP, but it's not clear that was going to get through Congress anyway. This NAFTA, he didn't withdraw from NAFTA. We'll see how serious the renegotiation is. There was some talk, oh, he's gonna pull out of the South Korean trade agreement. That has not happened. So, and presidential candidates have talked tough on trade. And then when they get in office, the policy. So I'm not sure how much of a revolution it's a revolution in rhetoric. I'm not sure, we don't know because, but I'm not sure how much in practice it matters.
I do want to give actually students a chance. So, how about, are you a student? Yeah.
Yes.
How about you?
I wanted, Lucia Cohen, I wanted to know if there's, ones that we've seen this month of the administration, if there's any institutional impact that such an unprecedented president can have or might have had in this month.
Sure. Could you follow that up?
If this president has had an impact in the American institutions in these months, or if seeing his behavior, you can consider that he might have an impact on American institutions.
Okay. So bigger picture.
So, I mean, I think the most striking thing is his violation of all sorts of norms, first as a candidate, then as a president. But it really, for the long-term impact, it really depends his fate, what happens to him. Because if it ends really badly, people will see him as an aberration and not as a role model. He's already, whatever happens to him, he's proven certain points in ways that I think are disconcerting. Mitt Romney did not want to release his taxes. He wasn't required to by law, but that norm had developed, and he eventually decided he needed to take the hit. And I don't think it was even that bad for him. Trump said, no, I'm not going to do it. I don't care. And he got away with that. And he got away with so many other things as a candidate. Now, maybe he has a unique standing with the public, so rules don't apply to him. It's also the case he barely won. Very important to remember, he not only didn't win the popular vote, but he barely won the Electoral College. Had it not been for the intervention of James Comey, I don't think that would have happened. But he did win, okay? But we don't know how he's going to fare as president. Well, we know already that he's historically unpopular, and he has not been successful in the legislative arena. So if things end badly, some of his violation of norms will be seen as something to avoid in the future. If he rides it out, then I think it's more of an impact.
And then we'll look forward to, the Democrats nominating Kanye West.
Kid Rock.
Just a quick comment on this, that it seems minor, but he, I think permanently has changed the way presidents and others will communicate with the American public through the social media, through tweets. I think it's dangerous. I don't like it, but I think that is like a ratchet. We're up there now. We'll never go back on that, and that's one thing that's going to be with us, and it's a huge violation of norms and behavior from previous presidents.
So we are technically out of time, but there are a lot of questions that are still remaining. I think we'll go ahead and, if you don't mind, hold you for just one more. And I don't know. Okay, your hand went up first,
Okay.
so we'll go ahead and call on you.
I think the panel has underemphasized the emotional impact and maybe institutionalization that Trump has done across the board in certain areas. I think that his slogan, "Make America Great Again," was really "Make America White Male Again," and that he's had a tremendous impact on hate crimes on the rise, anti-women, anti-science, anti-labor. And my fear is that you're all professors and you've got the millennials in your hands. And unless there is an analysis of the huge impact that this man has had so far on this country in these areas, and I'm not sure what Congress can do about it or what each one of you can do about it, but I think the emotional impact has been tremendous, and that he is involved in deconstructing certainly everything that has mattered to me over the last 50 or 60 years. And I just want to know what your comments are on what I've just said.
Well, I actually was trying to make that point, that he is chipping away at institutions through the executive order approach and the conversations around it, making conversations permissible that were never permissible before, with respect to science, with respect to labor rights, with almost, well, not with anything, and even in foreign policy. Now, his execution and what happens next, I think David's right. I think whether or not it continues any bills or he gets defeated, I think things are still salvageable. But I feel the president as disruptor, from whatever side, is a new avenue that's opened up to us. How it will manifest, if he had some finesse, if he had a little poetry in him, he'd be formidable. So if you think of a candidate that had some of that and was trying to do some of the same things, I think it'd be a lot more dangerous and have a lot more significant impact. But it's hard to quantify that other than to say, yeah, things are changing in ways that are just not about whether legislation gets passed.
Jim?
Yeah, I didn't mean to not talk about that. Obviously, it's a major impact. I mean, for some people, the election was shock, then anger, and depression, and now resistance. And there's a lot of that going on at the state and local level, especially among women and others. But the attack based upon race and anti-labor and gender is certainly very important. It's sort of populist anger that he's appealing to, and it's not a wide base, but it's a significant base in America and his base, and something that we should all be worried about. And I think the Congress is pushing back on it, even the Republicans, especially after Charlottesville. And I think if he doesn't change, that'll continue to be a lot of tension there.
Jordan?
Yeah, just briefly, I would add journalists to the group that you mentioned too. I think one of the things that most disturbs me, and it goes back to the institutions question, is Trump's denigration of journalists. What I do take heart in on this point is that the moments when we have seen kind of the, I'd say, strongest and clearest statements of condemnation of Trump from leaders in both parties, aside from Trump, but I mean, like congressional leaders, other public figures, have been when on the sort of race-related issues, such as moments like Charlottesville, the Republican congressional leaders and Republicans nationally, many of them have criticized Trump directly on that. So that's something that I at least take heart in, that public figures in both parties are not just going along with that.
But in the meantime, Sessions is unraveling all sorts of things that were an attempt to address those questions of race and fairness and equity.
Right.
And, whatever that discussion is about Charlottesville, he's just kind of unwinding the whole darn thing.
And he's unwinding internally, it looks like, too, a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. David?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of what I meant when I was talking about violation of norms. I didn't mention all of them. But you mentioned we're professors and we have the millennials. That's true. I mentioned earlier they only date anyone before Obama might as well be Lincoln, as far as they're concerned. So
Now,
so
wait
that's
a
true.
minute, come back here and teach here, you'll find out they know a lot.
But
Yeah,
That's
maybe
just
you're,
Maryland.
maybe you're
They
Maryland
don't even know
students.
Monica Lewinsky.
Maryland, we're like baseball teams, and
Right.
Maryland stole him,
Right,
and he was
right.
one of our
Monica
stars.
Lewinsky could be these kids' mom. That's how young they are. I mean, that's what we're talking about. But
A lot of
but
them are in the room.
but what I'm going to say about this though is, in terms of your concerns, if it was up to the millennial generation, we wouldn't have President Trump. Okay, we'd probably have President Sanders actually. But
they didn't vote.
well, younger people never vote in high rates. That's not new. It's when people talk about something like, oh, younger people, oh, this is such a terrible campaign. It's always the worst of two evils. That you can find newspaper stories about people saying this when Humphrey and Nixon ran. Same thing, 50 years ago. You millennial voters don't like Trump. Trump's base is some of them will not be alive in 2020. And if even younger Republicans are more progressive on issues like immigration, LGBT rights, and climate change. So I don't think he's violated all sorts of norms. It is shocking, but it's also the case that just in general, the younger people who are becoming politically socialized, they react very strongly to who's in office, right? So when G.W. Bush was really unpopular, there are people, that was the Republican Party for them. They didn't remember Reagan. So I think that in the long term, Trump, all of his attitudes are not really reflected by in millennials, everything they're telling pollsters and in their behavior. So I'm not saying that you don't have cause for concern, but there's another way to look at it that's maybe more optimistic.
It is worth pointing out, though, that the thing really this comes down to, and David, you alluded to this before, and I think maybe others did as well, that a lot of this is going to come down to something that Trump really has, frankly, no control over, and neither does anybody else, which is the performance of the economy in 2020 and to a lesser extent in 2019. That's the thing that determines whether incumbent presidents get reelected more often than not. And if there's a strong economy, which can happen for any number of reasons, has nothing to do with any of this stuff we're talking about, he will get reelected probably, and then he will get viewed as a success, and then all of these norm violations get ratified and codified and validated and mimicked. Now, if he does not get reelected, I think there's a good chance that all of this gets remembered as an embarrassment, right? And like the McCarthy era or something like that, and we look back and we go, oh, wasn't that terrible? And then it goes down in the history books as, and there's this huge backlash within the Republican Party as well. But if he wins, then not only does this become a new norm, but also the Republican Party, which has been maybe, an in-the-closet party to a certain extent of ethno-nationalism for a long time, like David pointed out, but it's come out of the closet in this last election, and I think it becomes solidified as a party of ethno-nationalism if he wins again, which then maybe leads to the death of the Republican Party, given what you just said about millennials, but that would be interesting.
But David,
Yeah.
even if he loses with the
Yeah.
45% of the vote, it's out, and it's hard to kind of like walk around
Yeah.
the so-called elephant in the room.
Yeah. So I'm going to let Jim conclude, and then we're going to all get out of here.
My conclusion is very brief. I want to welcome David to American University. And as the new director, and he has lots of great plans for other forums in the future and research. David, this is the 352nd forum that we've had since 1979.
Did you look that up,
and this
or
is
have you-
this is one of the I did. This is one of the best, and I
has on the little
appreciate you
card.
putting it together.
Thank
Thanks,
you very
Dave.
much.
Welcome.
Very good.